So the object type is a pattern, kind of like a recipe of what you want. And so we don't actually have any birds yet from our definition here. We just defined the object. Kind of like when we define a function, we don't actually run it right away. When we define an object type, we don't actually have one right away. We just have the pattern for it. So when we actually want to get an instance of that object type, stamp that pattern out and put some data in there and give me a variable that's using it, we use the new keyword. So here's an example. We're saying var, and then our variable name is lead bird, and assign that a new bird. Take that pattern, give me a copy of that bird that I can use, and store it in the variable lead bird. Once we have that pattern and have stored it in the variable, then we can start looking at the functions and the properties that can be accessed just like an object literal. For example, we had this.xPosition defined. Remember, we said this.xPosition equals 200. Well, if we want to change that value to 10, we just say .xPosition and assign it a value. Just like when we have an array and we want to use the .length property, we just say .length. Or when we have object literals, we use that dot notation to get to the value. You use the same thing for the object type once you've created an instance. So now that we have from our pattern bird a lead bird, we can do .xPosition and change its value, or we could have alerted its value or written out its value. We access it through that dot notation. Same thing for the functions. We use that dot notation right here after the variable name and then put the function. Now draw was a function with no parameters. See, there were no parameters here. So we call that with just the parentheses, and that will execute this code here, which draws our bird at this position. Now, our birds has a fixed X position and Y position right now. So every bird that we create is going to be at 200, 100. And if we want to change those positions, we would have to use the dot notation and update the position for every bird we create. Well, it would be nice if we could create the birds with the correct data right away. So let's look at how we can do that. Here we have our bird and we're creating the pattern, and now we're passing in 3 parameters. We're passing in an X, a Y, and a color. We're saying it's a function defined by taking 3 parameters, and we're using those parameters to initialize this X position. This Y position is equal to the Y, which is the second parameter, and this color is equal to the color passed in, which is the third parameter. Now that we've created our pattern to take parameters, we can use that to create our birds with different colors and different locations. So maybe our lead bird is staying at position 200, 100. We're going to pass in the 200 to the 100, but then we're going to set also a new color. So notice how there's a comma here, and this whole function call is the parameter. It's saying create a color with the 25500, and whatever that color that's returned from that call to the color function will be the color that will be passed in here, which then can be assigned to the color parameter. So we can create different birds with variations by using those parameters. Once we've created each of our instances By calling the new bird function, we can now call the methods on each bird. So we have .draw for each of our birds, and now we're going to have five of our birds, and hopefully they're still in a V shape if we kept our numbers correctly. We'll have 5 birds. But this code is looking a lot busier than our original Flying South program. We are calling draw on every variable. And before we used an array. Well, it sure would be nice to use an array. How can we put instances of this bird object type into an array? We just use our square brackets. So we say create a variable birds that is an array. All we need is the square bracket to say it's an array, and then we can make a list of things separated by commas. Well, creating a new bird is just one item. And these are just the parameters that we're passing in to create the bird. And that gives us one bird instance. So then we put a comma here, and then we can create another one and add it to our array. And so forth until we get to the last one, and then we don't need the comma because we're at the end of our list. Now that we've got our birds in an array, we can loop through that array calling the draw function. Now we're going to go from 0, because that's the index where arrays start, to less than birds.length. Well, remember that's a property of an array, the dot length, and so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 birds. So it's going to go from 0 to less than 5. So we're going to go through 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and stop. And for each element in the birds array, we're going to use that square notation again, and those indexes are going to go through and go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to draw all those birds.